Shells lie buried beneath the ancient sands of North Africa, within the limestone chambers of caves near the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Here archaeologists have uncovered a discovery that stretches back far beyond the span of written memory. Tiny weathered beads made from marine shells rest in layers of sediment dated to nearly 150,000 years ago. They are simple objects no larger than a fingertip pierced by holes that allowed them to be strung or suspended, yet they carry a significance far greater than their size, for they represent the earliest known jewellery created by human hands. This moment in prehistory is set against the backdrop of shifting climates and wandering coastlines. The Sahara, which today dominates northern Africa as a vast desert, was at times a green corridor alive with rivers and lakes. Across thousands of years, bands of early Homo sapiens adapted to these changes, following animals and seasonal rains. In such uncertain worlds, the making of ornaments marks a threshold hinting that people did not live by subsistence alone. The shells come from species that inhabit shallow coastal waters. Their presence deep inside caves more than 100 kilometers from the sea indicates deliberate transport, suggesting that groups journeyed inland carrying reminders of the coast. Some bear traces of red ochre, a mineral pigment that stains the surface with lasting colour. Others show dark soot evidence that they once lay near campfires where the smoke altered their hue. These details reveal hands at work drilling small holes, threading fibres, and perhaps arranging the beads in sequences that carried meaning beyond decoration. The methods used to confirm their age are themselves a triumph of science. Stratigraphic analysis traces the layers of Earth in which they were found, aligning them with known climatic shifts. Uranium series dating measures the decay of isotopes within the surrounding deposits, fixing the beads within a timeline that reaches back to the dawn of symbolic behaviour. While no one can stand among those ancient caves to witness their creation, the evidence left behind is consistent and compelling. A mystery remains at the heart of these objects. Did they signify group belonging, a visible marker of identity in a landscape where different bands might cross paths? Were they exchanged as gifts, tokens of alliance or kinship, or did they hold spiritual significance linked to beliefs now lost to time? Scholars continue to debate these questions, for the beads do not reveal their purpose as clearly as they reveal their age. They whisper of intentions but not of motives. On the planetary scale, their story is set within the rhythms of the Ice Age. As glaciers expanded in the North Sea levels dropped, exposing wider coastlines. The shores where these shells once lived stretched farther into the Atlantic, providing easier access for those who gathered them. At other times, seas rose, covering the same lands again. Such fluctuations altered not only coastlines, but the very routes along which humans travelled. Against this vast backdrop, the act of turning shells into ornaments is both fragile and enduring. These beads mark a tradition older than twice the span of recorded history, a practice that binds people to place and to one another across immeasurable time. In the quiet of the cave, in the darkness preserved by stone, the world's oldest known jewellery speaks of a humanity already reaching beyond survival, already shaping identity through the language of objects. Awaiting continue. The hands that carved the beads belong to early Homo sapiens people who lived in small mobile groups across the shifting landscapes of North Africa. Archaeologists studying the perforated shells have found tiny drill marks etched into their surfaces, clear evidence of intentional modification. These marks are not random scratches from the sea or the tumbling of sand. They follow deliberate patterns where pointed stone tools pierce the shell's edge. The edges around the holes are smoothed, worn by contact with fibres or sinew, as though the beads were strung and worn against skin. The presence of soot suggests that they were sometimes placed near fires, perhaps as ornaments, that caught the glow of flames in the dim interiors of caves. Their craftsmanship is modest, but it requires planning dexterity and shared knowledge. To drill a hole in a fragile shell without shattering it, one must know where to place pressure and how to steady the tool. This is an early form of technology rooted not in utility, but in expression. The choice to spend time shaping shells rather than shaping tools for hunting or cutting demonstrates a new kind of value, one tied to meaning rather than necessity. Archaeologists sometimes uncover beads in clusters as if they had been strung together and dropped or placed intentionally in the soil. In Morocco's Bismoon cave, dozens of beads were found in association enough to suggest they were once part of a necklace bracelet or sewn onto clothing. Each bead bears a story of effort carried from the shoreline selected for shape, pierced with care and polished through use. They reveal not just a single act but a repeated tradition passed through generations. One detail that stands out is their uniformity. Many of the shells belong to the same species Nassarius gibbosulus, a small marine snail. The consistency of species hints at selective choice, as if certain shells were favoured for their size or symbolic resonance. Such patterns suggest more than ornamentation. They suggest shared standards, perhaps even shared symbols. Still, the true meaning remains uncertain. Some researchers propose that the beads served as markers of identity in a world where encounters between groups were rare but significant. Visible adornments could quickly signal kinship, alliance, or difference. Others suggest the beads may have held ritual significance, perhaps tied to beliefs about the sea, the animals, or ancestral spirits. The absence of direct evidence leaves these interpretations unresolved. The unanswered questions remind us that while the beads are tangible, the thoughts behind them are not. Beyond their human significance, the beads reflect broader conditions of the Earth itself. Around 150,000 years ago, glacial cycles shaped environments with relentless rhythm. Expanding ice sheets locked water into frozen masses, drawing down sea levels and exposing wide coastal plains. These plains offered shell-rich tidal zones accessible to people who sought food and material along the shore. Later, as ice retreated, seas rose again, submerging those same plains beneath waves. Such movements altered the geography of human life, repeatedly opening and closing pathways for migration. Against these sweeping changes, the carving of beads is a quiet human act, small but profound. It reveals an ability to create stability in the face of shifting worlds, to hold on to symbols even as rivers dried or coastlines vanished. The shells endure as fragile records of thought, reminding us that early humans sought meaning, not only in survival, but in what could be carried, worn and shown to others. Awaiting continue. Far from the coast where the shells were gathered, beads appear in sites located more than 100 kilometers inland. This distance is striking, for it implies deliberate movement and purposeful transport. The people who lived in these regions did not stumble upon the shells by chance. They carried them across dry river valleys, rocky plateaus and shifting savannas. The inland presence of marine ornaments suggests that jewellery was valued highly enough to travel with its makers, a portable form of meaning carried across landscapes of uncertainty. In some cases, shells have been found in caves where no direct link to the sea exists, preserved in layers of sediment, alongside stone tools and traces of hearths. Their placement raises questions about their role within communities. Were they personal possessions worn daily, or items brought out only during gatherings or rituals? The polish on certain beads indicates repeated handling, perhaps as they brushed against skin or cloth over long periods of use. Each worn edge is a record of time, a sign that these objects mattered in ways beyond their decorative form. The distances involved also raise the possibility of exchange. If groups far from the coast possessed beads, they may have acquired them through contact with coastal bands. Such exchange networks, though modest, represent the beginnings of broader human interaction, gifts passed from hand to hand, tokens that travelled farther than the people who first gathered them. This is one of the earliest hints of trade or symbolic connection, not of commodities, but of meaning itself. Scholars debate how far such networks may have reached. Some argue that the inland finds prove long-distance movement, while others suggest smaller localized patterns of sharing. Either way, the beads highlight a web of connections that extended beyond immediate survival needs. The landscape around these journeys was not static. Around 150,000 years ago, North Africa shifted between humid and arid phases as Ice Age cycles altered rainfall patterns. During wetter intervals, grasslands and lakes spread across regions now covered in desert. These green corridors allowed humans and animals to move more freely, providing the pathways along which shells could be carried inland. When conditions turned arid again, those same routes closed, leaving beads buried in caves as silent markers of journeys no longer possible. The inland discoveries carry a mystery still unresolved. Were beads deliberately left behind as offerings or simply lost during moments of upheaval? Were they buried with individuals serving as personal symbols of identity or status? Archaeologists rarely find them directly associated with burials from this early period, leaving their exact context uncertain. What is clear, however, is their persistence across distance and time. On the planetary scale, these movements align with larger climatic rhythms. As glaciers advanced in Europe and Asia, ecosystems shifted globally. The Sahara pulsed between fertile and barren states, its rivers flowing one millennium and vanishing the next. In this context, the act of transporting shells far from their source is not a trivial gesture. It is a reminder that even as the Earth transformed on scales of continents and oceans, humans carried small objects that bound them to memory, place, and one another. Fragile though they are, the beads travelled farther than the seashells from which they came, leaving us with the first evidence that humans sought meaning across landscapes, not just within them. Awaiting continue. The extraordinary age of these beads has been confirmed through a series of careful scientific methods that anchor them firmly in deep time. In the caves of Morocco, including Bismoun near Essaouira, archaeologists excavated the layers of sediment in which the shells lay, each stratum a page in Earth's own archive. Stratigraphy allows researchers to trace the relative sequence of deposits, ensuring that the beads belong to the same ancient horizon as the tools and hearths found nearby. Yet to move from sequence to absolute age, more precise techniques were needed. Uranium series dating has been applied to calcite formations within the cave, measuring the steady decay of isotopes locked in mineral deposits. By comparing the ratio of uranium to thorium, scientists establish a timeline that places the beads around 142,000 to 150,000 years ago. This method, combined with luminescence dating of surrounding sediments, provides converging evidence that the jewellery belongs to one of the earliest known expressions of symbolic behaviour. The beads are not intrusive elements fallen from later periods, but integral to their ancient context. Such a result pushes back the timeline of human symbolic activity far beyond what was once assumed, showing that the capacity for adornment appeared long before the famous cave paintings of Europe. The details strengthen this conclusion. The sediment layers bear no signs of disturbance that would allow younger objects to drift downward. The shells themselves are coated in mineral deposits, consistent with long burial, their surfaces altered by geologic time. Each method cross-checks the other, reinforcing the interpretation that these objects truly belong to the earliest chapters of Homo sapiens. Still, debates continue. Some researchers argue over the precision of uranium series dating at this scale, pointing out that uncertainties can span thousands of years. Others question whether all beads found in nearby sites belong to the same cultural horizon. Such debates are not signs of doubt in the discovery's importance, but reminders of the rigor required to anchor fragile artifacts within deep time. Scientific consensus accepts that these shells represent jewelry of unprecedented age, even if exact numbers continue to be refined. On a planetary level, these findings coincide with a period of shifting climate known as marine isotope stage 6, when glacial expansion altered ecosystems worldwide. Vast ice sheets in the northern hemisphere locked away oceans, lowering sea levels by more than 100 meters. This reshaped coastlines, exposing tidal zones rich with shells that would later be chosen as beads. At the same time, regions like North Africa experienced alternating humid and arid phases, sometimes opening savannas that supported migrations, sometimes closing them into inhospitable deserts. Against these immense rhythms, the persistence of small ornaments may seem slight, but their endurance across millennia makes them significant. They provide a scale of human continuity that stretches across landscapes repeatedly transformed. The confirmation of their age allows us to see not just an isolated moment, but a tradition emerging at the dawn of symbolic life. Whether worn as necklaces sewn into clothing or carried as tokens, the beads remind us that even as Earth's climate swung between extremes, people sought ways to mark themselves and their connections. These earliest ornaments anchor human history not only in survival, but in the expression of meaning, bridging the gap between fragile lives and the immensity of geological time. Awaiting continue. The perforated shells are significant because they reveal an entirely new dimension of early human life symbolic thought. Tools, hearths, and hunting strategies speak to survival, but jewelry speaks to meaning. A shell, pierced and worn, has no role in cutting, scraping, or gathering food. Its purpose lies in communication, in signaling something about the wearer to others. This act of transforming a natural object into a symbol marks one of the first known steps toward cultural expression. Archaeologists interpret the beads as evidence that humans at this time were capable of abstract thought, the ability to assign value beyond the immediate and practical. These shells were chosen, modified, and worn in ways that suggest recognition of identity status or shared belonging. Some carry traces of pigment, hinting that they may have been deliberately colored to enhance their visibility. The act of applying ochre itself, one of the earliest symbolic substances, reinforces the interpretation that adornment was intentional and meaningful. A lesser-known detail is the uniformity of choices. Beads from Morocco and other sites are often crafted from the same species of marine snail. This consistency suggests more than happenstance. It may reflect an agreed-upon preference within communities, a shared standard of what counted as ornament. Such agreement implies that meaning was not only personal, but collective, understood by those who saw the beads. Still, the exact significance remains a mystery. Did the beads mark adulthood, partnership, or membership in a group? Were they protective charms imbued with associations of the sea, or simply signs of beauty? No definitive answer is possible, for the people who wore them left no written record. The beads survive, but the stories they carried remain silent. Their silence, however, does not diminish their importance. It makes them the earliest witnesses to the symbolic imagination of humankind. On the planetary scale, this emergence of symbolism coincides with climatic instability. During this period, environments across Africa fluctuated dramatically between fertile grasslands and arid deserts. Such cycles forced human groups to adapt repeatedly, testing their resilience. Jewelry may have provided a psychological anchor, a way of reinforcing group identity in the face of displacement. In unstable worlds, visible symbols could help people recognize kin and allies, offering continuity even as rivers dried and coastlines shifted. The making of ornaments thus reflects not only a cognitive milestone, but also a social adaptation, a subtle strategy for survival. In scale, the appearance of symbolic objects stretches far beyond their immediate context. Written history spans a few thousand years. These beads extend symbolic behavior back 150 millennia, more than 20 times that span. They remind us that the roots of culture are ancient, that long before the first cities or scripts, humans were already marking themselves with symbols. The beads from Morocco are not isolated curiosities, but the first notes in a long continuity of symbolic expression that will later include painted caves, carved figurines, and musical instruments. They are the earliest whispers of a language that would one day shape all human societies, the language of meaning carried in objects. Awaiting continue. The beads of Morocco do not stand alone in the archaeological record. Similar discoveries appear in other regions, suggesting that the idea of ornamentation spread widely across early human groups. In Israel's School and Kafsa caves, perforated shells have been found in association with early Homo sapiens burials dating back more than 100,000 years. These beads crafted from marine gastropods show the same signs of deliberate modification: holes, carefully drilled surfaces smoothed and sometimes marked with pigment. Their presence in burials adds another layer of meaning, for they may have been placed with the dead as tokens of identity or remembrance. In Algeria's Tafaralt cave, additional shell beads dating to about 82,000 years ago reinforce the pattern of widespread adornment traditions. These finds suggest that the practice of creating symbolic jewellery was not confined to one population or one region, but echoed across continents over tens of thousands of years. The recurrence of similar ornaments, often made from the same species of shell, hints at deep continuities in symbolic behaviour. A lesser-known detail emerges from the fact that some of these shells were found far from the sea, once again implying transport or exchange. The distances involved reveal that shells were not simply picked up casually, but valued enough to be carried across landscapes, whether by migration, trade, or ritual journeying. This repeated pattern across regions underscores the importance of jewellery as more than mere decoration. Still, questions remain unresolved. Did these traditions emerge independently in separate groups, or were they carried and shared through long-term contacts between communities? The beads are too old to trace direct lines of transmission, yet the similarities raise the possibility of shared cognitive frameworks, convergent expressions of symbolic life. Some scholars suggest that ornamentation may have been a universal impulse of early Homo sapiens, arising wherever conditions allowed, while others argue for more localized origins. The truth remains uncertain, suspended in the silence of prehistory. On the planetary scale, these echoes of adornment appear during intervals of fluctuating climate. Around 100,000 years ago, the Earth moved through phases of glaciation and interglaciation, altering coastlines and reshaping habitats. As sea levels fell, new shorelines opened, exposing tidal flats that teemed with shells. Later, as glaciers melted, those same shores were drowned once more. Human populations adapted within this shifting framework, moving with the rhythms of climate and sea. The repeated choice of shells as ornaments may reflect not only their abundance, but their enduring presence in environments transformed by cycles of ice and water. Jewellery thus connects people to landscapes as much as to one another. In scale, the spread of bead-making traditions across Africa and the Levant spans distances longer than modern nations, a continuity of symbolic behaviour that endures across generations, measured not in centuries but in millennia. These ornaments are small, yet they testify to vast networks of meaning carried through time as surely as through space. They remind us that long before writing or art as we know it, humans already shared a symbolic language carved into shells, a language that could cross deserts, mountains, and seas. Awaiting continue. The purpose of these earliest ornaments remains an open question, one that continues to intrigue archaeologists and anthropologists alike. Jewelry by its nature carries meaning, yet the exact meanings of these ancient beads are lost to us. Some scholars propose that the beads functioned as markers of group identity, visible signals in a world where encounters with strangers could carry risk or opportunity. A necklace of shells might have served as a quiet declaration. This person belongs to our group, carries our traditions, and speaks our symbols. Others suggest the beads marked stages of life, bestowed at moments of initiation or adulthood. Their presence in some burials adds weight to the idea that they played a role in rituals of passage. Another possibility is that they served as expressions of beauty, a concept already rooted in human cognition, even at such early times. The traces of red ochre hint at a desire for visual enhancement, an impulse familiar across cultures and ages. Yet none of these interpretations can be proven with certainty. The beads whisper of meaning, but do not tell us what that meaning was. This ambiguity is part of their fascination, objects so simple, yet so profoundly enigmatic. A lesser-known detail emerges from the wear patterns on some shells, suggesting that beads may have been strung and restrung, perhaps rearranged as needs or fashions changed. Their holes are often smoothed not only from initial piercing but from repeated contact with fibres, as if they were threaded many times over. This implies long use, not single occasions, adding to their mystery. Were they passed from generation to generation, carrying memories of ancestors, or were they reconfigured for each new context, their symbolism shifting with the moment? Archaeologists continue to debate these questions, finding only fragments of answers in the stones and sediments. On a planetary scale, the uncertainty mirrors the shifting conditions of Earth itself during these millennia. Climatic cycles repeatedly transformed environments, creating unpredictability that humans navigated through adaptation. Perhaps ornaments provided psychological anchors in unstable worlds, ways of reinforcing belonging and continuity when landscapes changed beyond recognition. In this sense, jewelry may have been both symbolic and practical, strengthening bonds that increased resilience. The scale of time involved adds another layer of perspective. If the beads indeed marked identity or ritual, they represent traditions that endured for thousands of years, far longer than many entire civilizations of recorded history. This endurance across landscapes altered by ice and desert reveals how meaning itself can persist even when its precise form is forgotten. The unanswered purposes of the beads remind us that archaeology often uncovers more questions than answers. What we hold are shells drilled by hands like ours, but we do not hold the thoughts that guided those hands. Still, the very fact of their making is enough to show that humans had already begun to live, not only in the physical world of food and shelter, but in the symbolic world of ideas, identities, and shared meaning. Awaiting continue. The story of the beads is inseparable from the story of the planet itself, for they were created during one of Earth's most dynamic climatic phases. Around 150,000 years ago, the world lay deep within an ice age, its great cycles governed by shifts in the Earth's orbit and tilt. Vast glaciers advanced across northern latitudes, locking immense quantities of water in frozen sheets. Sea levels dropped more than 100 meters below those of today, revealing coastlines that stretched far beyond their modern limits. Where waves now crash against cliffs, ancient tidal flats once extended outward, rich with marine life and scattered with the shells later gathered by human hands. In North Africa, conditions fluctuated between humid and arid intervals. During wetter phases, rivers coursed through what is now desert-feeding lakes that attracted animals and people alike. These green Sahara episodes provided migration routes across regions that otherwise formed barriers of sand and heat. In arid phases, deserts expanded, isolating groups and closing corridors. The beads carried inland or left behind in caves reflect human persistence across these oscillating environments. A lesser-known detail is that climatic shifts did not only alter landscapes but also influenced the availability of symbolic materials. Shell's ochre and other pigments were more abundant and accessible in certain conditions. The act of gathering them, therefore, was not only symbolic but opportunistic, tied to the planet's rhythms of wet and dry ice and thaw. When seas receded, tidal zones yielded shells in abundance. When they rose, access to those same zones diminished. Jewelry traditions may have flourished or waned in tandem with these cycles, their continuity intertwined with climate itself. The mystery that remains is whether such ornaments played a role in guiding human movement. Did groups follow coastlines not only for food but also for symbolic materials? Some researchers suggest that the presence of beads far inland hints at purposeful journeys, perhaps to places remembered and revisited for the shells they offered. Others argue that symbolic behavior emerged independently wherever conditions allowed, not as a driver of movement but as a reflection of broader cultural capacities. This question has no clear answer, yet it underscores how closely the symbolic and the environmental were connected. On the planetary scale, the Ice Age created a world of extremes, yet within it humans found constancy through objects like beads. The glaciers advanced and retreated. Seas fell and rose. Deserts blossomed into grasslands and withered back to sand. Across these immense changes, the act of piercing a shell and wearing it endured. This continuity highlights the resilience of symbolic behavior against the backdrop of Earth's instability. In scale, these climatic oscillations spanned tens of millennia, yet through them humans carried fragile tokens of meaning. The beads thus bridged the geological and the cultural, anchoring human history to the pulse of planetary change. They show that even in times of vast uncertainty, early Homo sapiens created symbols that outlasted the shifting face of the Earth itself. Awaiting continue. The beads of Morocco and their echoes elsewhere foreshadow later symbolic traditions that emerge across the Old World. After 100,000 years ago, evidence of ochre use becomes widespread with pigments ground into powders and applied to surfaces or perhaps skin. In South Africa's Blombos cave, pieces of ochre bear deliberate engravings, cross-hatched marks that serve no practical function, but suggest symbolic intent. Around the same time, humans begin carving patterns into bone and stone, subtle expressions of an imagination reaching beyond immediate needs. By 40,000 years ago, this trajectory expands into the full flowering of symbolic culture. Cave paintings of animals in France and Spain, ivory figurines in Germany, bone flutes that produce music in subterranean chambers. These later achievements are celebrated as milestones of human creativity, yet their roots can be traced back to the quiet act of piercing a shell and wearing it upon the body. The beads are small beginnings, but beginnings nonetheless. A lesser-known detail is that some later symbolic objects appear in contexts not linked to habitation, but to gathering places, caves where groups assembled only intermittently. Jewelry may have played a role in such encounters long before painted walls and carved figures. Portable, durable, and visible beads were symbols that could travel with the person, bridging the spaces between gatherings and leaving traces even in absence. The continuity from beads to pigments to art is not linear, but the shared thread is unmistakable. Humans repeatedly transform natural materials into symbols of meaning. The mystery that lingers is whether this trajectory was inevitable. Did all groups who survived long enough eventually adopt symbolic behavior, or did it depend on fragile conditions, accidents of environment or cultural transmission? The beads suggest that the capacity existed far earlier than once thought, but whether it was universal or sporadic remains unresolved. Some researchers argue that symbolic expression was a core feature of Homo sapiens from the beginning, while others believe it emerged gradually unevenly across time and place. On the planetary scale, these questions are framed by continuing cycles of climate. As Ice Age conditions deepened, human groups were tested by scarcity, forced to migrate or innovate to survive. Symbolic traditions may have provided not only identity, but cohesion, strengthening bonds that allowed groups to endure. In times of plenty, symbols might flourish as expressions of abundance. In times of hardship, they may have served as reminders of belonging. Across both, the impulse to create meaning persisted. In scale, the beads stand at the dawn of this long arc spanning more than 100 millennia before the great painted caves of Europe. They reveal that the symbolic world was not a sudden explosion, but a slow accumulation layer upon layer across vast stretches of time. The first pierced shells are thus not isolated curiosities, but the foundations of the symbolic landscapes that later define human history. They remind us that before the walls of caves bore images, the human body itself was the first canvas adorned with shells that carried meaning across generations, awaiting continue. Across continents and millennia, the fragile shells continue to speak, carrying within them the earliest traces of how humans expressed belonging. They are modest in form, yet their endurance reveals much about the nature of human life. Jewelry is never a necessity for survival, yet it emerges repeatedly in the archaeological record, suggesting that meaning, identity, and connection have always been part of what it means to be human. The Moroccan beads, the ornaments of Israel, the pierced shells of Algeria all contribute to a pattern that stretches back 150,000 years. Their survival into the present allows us to glimpse the continuity of symbolic life across time so deep it dwarfs all written history. A lesser-known detail is that some beads were found not only in habitation layers, but also scattered within sediments devoid of other cultural materials, as though they had been lost, discarded, or perhaps intentionally left behind. Their isolated presence hints at multiple possibilities: careless loss, deliberate deposition, or symbolic offering. Each interpretation opens a window into human thought, yet none can be proven. The beads are eloquent in their silence, telling us only that they were made worn and eventually left behind. The great unresolved question remains their purpose. Did they serve as social signals, ritual tokens, or aesthetic adornments? Or were they all these things at once, depending on time and circumstance? The uncertainty is part of their power, a reminder that meaning in prehistory can rarely be pinned down with precision. What is clear is that these ornaments represent the dawn of symbolic culture, one of the most profound transitions in human history. On the planetary scale, their story is written into the rhythms of climate and geology. As seas rose and fell by hundreds of meters, as deserts turned green and green turned again to dust, these small shells were carried through shifting landscapes. They endured while entire ecosystems appeared and vanished. Their persistence mirrors the resilience of the people who made them, adapting continually to a world in flux. The beads show that even in times of uncertainty, humans created continuity through symbols. In scale, their antiquity is staggering. They are older than the last, interglacial, older than many glacial advances, older than almost every trace of cultural expression known to us. They extend human symbolic life to a span that dwarfs the timelines of kingdoms, empires, and civilizations. They remind us that culture is not a recent invention, but a deep inheritance carried across hundreds of millennia. As the oldest known jewelry, the beads hold a unique place in the record of humanity. They are both fragile and enduring, vulnerable to breakage yet lasting through unimaginable spans of time. They carry the fingerprints of early human imagination, the quiet insistence that life is not only to be lived, but to be expressed. In the darkness of caves and beneath the sands of deserts, they remain as small but powerful witnesses to the origins of symbolic life. End of script.